So this is my reading and commentary and reflection on the Platonic dialogue, The Statesman. This is part 4. Now, recapping these sorts of things is always difficult, because there's always a lot that has been discussed. Different tributaries have been explored. But generally speaking, we found ourselves being introduced last time to a mythological structure that the visitor is introducing. Within this structure, there are images of identities that are interconnected in the form of circles. And the circumference of that circle is the existence or the experience of the identity, whether that be a material object or it be a human being. There are images of a creator, of a first mover that sets all of it into motion. And there are ideas of a scale, the scale being on one end approaching the divine, the heavenly, the cosmological, and then on the inferior end things that are extremely finite. I think perhaps an insect that might last a month or a week before they expire. And along all of this, we have different principles that we can consider. We can think about permanence. We can think about the degree to which they may change and how this relates to their condition and their state. And when we think about things that are more on the heavenly side of things, of that spectrum, they're more resistant to change. They are more secured in their foundations, in their being, let's say. And it's this way by necessity. But all of these things are subject to that first cause, the mover of movers, who may perhaps cyclically adjust things as needed to maintain balance, to maintain structure, to maintain the form of that which is. So, the general outline of these dialogues has been to read 2 pages and then to go back and interpret. So that is what I'm going to do here. It might vary a little bit from time to time. And today, it might vary a little bit, but we'll see how it goes. So last time I had just finished most of the second page of what I was on, so I'm going to be continuing with the last little section of the second page, and then get into the next 2. So young Socrates is one of our interlocutors, and the visitor is the other. So young Socrates says, "It certainly seems that everything you have gone through is very reasonable. Then drawing on what's been said, let's reflect on the state of affairs we said was responsible for all those astonishing things. In fact, it's just this very thing." Young Socrates says, "What's that?" The visitor says, "That the movement of the universe is now in the direction of its present rotation, now in the opposite direction." He says, "How do you mean?" The visitor, "We must suppose that this change is, of the turnings that occur in the heavens, the greatest and the most complete turning of all." Yes, it certainly seems so. We must suppose, then, that at that time the greatest changes also occur for us who live within the universe. That too seems likely. And don't we recognize that living creatures by their nature have difficulty in tolerating changes that are at once large, great in number, and in all different sorts? Certainly we do. Necessarily, then, there occur at that time cases of destruction of other living creatures on a very large scale, and humankind itself survives only in small numbers. Many new and astonishing things happen to them, but the greatest is the one I shall describe, one that is in accordance with the retrogradation of the universe. At the time when its turning becomes the opposite of the one that now obtains. What kind of thing do you mean? Says young Socrates. First, the visible age of each and every creature, whatever it was, stopped increasing, and everything that was mortal ceased moving in the direction of looking older. Instead, it changed back in the opposite direction, and grew as it were younger, more tender. The white hairs of the older men became black, and in turn the cheeks of those who had their beards became smooth again, returning each to his past bloom. The bodies of those in their puberty, becoming smoother and smaller each day and night, went back to the form of newborn children, which they came to resemble both in mind and in body. And from then on they proceeded to waste away until they simply disappeared altogether. As for those who died a violent death at that time, the body of the dead person underwent the same effects and quickly dissolved to nothing in a few days. But, visitor, how did living creatures come into being in that time, and in what way were they produced from each other? Clearly, Socrates, reproduction from one another was not part of the nature of things then. It was the earth-born race, the one that said to have existed once, that existed then, returning to life again from the earth. It was remembered by our first ancestors, who lived in the succeeding time but bordered on the ending of the previous period, growing up at the beginning of this one. They became our messengers for the accounts of the earth-born, which are nowadays wrongly disbelieved by many people. For I think we must reflect on what is implied by what we have said. If old men went back to being children, it follows that people should be put together again from the dead, there in the earth, and come back to life. They would be following the reversal of things, with coming into being turning round with it to the opposite direction, and since they would, according to this argument, necessarily come into existence as earth-born, they would thus acquire that name and have that account given of them. All those of them, that is, whom God did not take off to another destiny. Young Socrates says, yes, quite. This does seem to follow on what went before. But as for the life which you say there was in the time of Kronos' power, was it in that period of rotation, or in this one? For it clearly turns out that the changes affecting the stars and the sun occur in each period. Now at this point there's a footnote saying, alternatively, quote, at each of the two turnings. The word period in the text is elsewhere turning, reversal of the direction of rotation. The translation in the text is based on the assumption that in the myth, as a whole, the visitor envisages two eras, during both of which the cosmos rotates, as it now does, from east to west. One era, when it is under God's control, one under its own inherent power, separated by a relatively brief period of rotation in the reverse direction, so that when the sun rises in the west and sets in the east, or I should say, so that then the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. This reverse rotation begins immediately after the god releases control, i.e., at the outset of the time when the cosmos rules itself, and it ends when the cosmos gains sufficient self-possession to return to rotating in the normal east to west direction. On this interpretation, the visitor has just been describing the earth-born people as existing during the relatively brief period of reverse rotation. And young Socrates now asks whether the golden age of Kronos also occurred during that time, or instead in the era that preceded it. The alternative translation fits with a different interpretation of the myth, which is that of most scholars. According to this prevailing interpretation, the visitor envisages more simply two alternating eras, one of west to east rotation under God's control, and one of east to west rotation. We are familiar with this latter. For us normal, direction of rotation occupies the whole of the time when the cosmos is under self-rule. On this interpretation, there is no intervening brief period of reverse rotation. So the visitor's description of the earth-born people has placed them in the era of God's control. Accordingly, young Socrates is now asking whether the golden age of Kronos existed in that same era, or instead during the era we now live in. So the visitor continues, "You have been keeping up with the argument well. As for what you asked, about everything springing up of its own accord for human beings, it belongs least to the period that now obtains. It too belonged to the one before, and for then the god began to rule and take care of the rotation itself as a whole. And as for the regions, in their turn, it was just the same, the parts of the world order having everywhere been divided up by gods ruling over them. As for living things, divine spirits had divided them between themselves like herdsmen, by kind and by herd, each by himself providing independently for all the needs of those he tended, so that none of them was savage, nor did they eat each other, and there was no war or internal dissent at all. And as for all the other things that belonged as consequences to such an arrangement, there would be tens of thousands of them to report. But to return to what we have been told about human life without toil, the origin of the report is something like this. A god tended to them, taking charge of them himself, just as now human beings, themselves living creatures, but different, more divine. Pasture other kinds of living creatures, more lowly than themselves. And given this tendance, they had no political constitutions, nor acquired wives and children, for all of them that came back to life from the earth, remembering nothing of the past. While they lacked things of this sort, they had an abundance of fruits from trees and many other plants, which grew not through cultivation, but because the earth sent them up of its own accord. For the most part, they would feed outdoors, naked and without bedding, for the blend of the seasons was without painful extremes, and they had soft beds from abundant grass that sprang from the earth. What you are hearing about, then, Socrates, is the life of those who lived in the time of Cronus. As for this one, which they say is in the time of Zeus, the present one, you are familiar with it from personal experience. Would you be able and willing to judge which of the two is more fortunate? Okay, so that concludes those 2 pages. I want to pause for a moment. I think this is a good place to have this reflection There was an incident that occurred today that had excited my heart. And that excitement of heart, at times I'm more equipped to handle the intensity of it, the flow of it. But in this particular incident, I let my emotions get the better of me. Now, I don't think they translated into some explosive behavior, but they did translate into a type of passivity, an absence of mind that is equally as bad. Now, this had to do with something over matters of faith. This happened at work. And I found myself in a place where I knew where I was, but I didn't know where the person that I was talking to was. It was kind of a frightening thing not to know where, physically, of course, you know where the person is. They're right in front of you. But mentally, you don't know where their mind is. And the idea of that, of having these sort of two locations, one in the minded domain and one in the physical, I think accurately describes a few different sentiments or emotional outbursts at the time that I was unable to tie down appropriately. One was that there was this desire to lasso the mind of this person and to anchor it into something that was familiar to myself, a bit of a selfish pursuit. But I should have established something for both of us to anchor ourselves in a particular conversation. Now, this is easier said than done, especially given a work context where many conversations are sort of flippant and superficial. There was surprise, there was regret, there was frustration. But the worst of all was, as I've mentioned, that passivity of mind. Now, why do I mention this? Why do I bring this up? I think where we are entering into now is something quite similar. That from my perspective, trying to understand and to see where the mind of the visitor is not easy. Do we give an excuse of somebody that had thought a particular way because of convention? Do we say that there is something deeper that will somehow serve as a productive beginning for us to tie things together, that is not exposed to a type of support that would necessarily bolster a strong belief in something? The sophist is a perfect analogy or a perfect character to have explored just before this dialogue. Because as we find ourselves in the same place, communicating, articulating with the same principles of being and non-being, we find ourselves nonetheless in the fog, trying to sift our way through things that the small mind is trying to see, is trying to reach for, but cannot grasp. The last thing that I would want to do is to find myself in a position that I was in earlier today, where my interlocutor is the cause for my disaffection. Now, of course, when I'm alone, I'm responsible for myself. But as I'm responsible here for myself, it is not for me to disaffect myself, to push myself away from goodness and understanding, but rather to challenge and to come to an understanding that is not just perpetually contrary, because while in the short term that contrarian mode may help divide and come to a more foundational understanding of things, it is not a place to rest. It is not an ending. It is more of a beginning and an exploratory exercise. And how difficult it is to think about the cosmic scale of things. That there is a thread that connects all of it. And by this thread that connects all of what we know, what we see, to imagine a turning that affects all of us individually, as well as all of the heavenly bodies. Quite the difficult task. Now he says, the visitor, that at the time of the greatest turning, we see the greatest changes. He says, we recognize that living creatures by their nature have difficulty in tolerating changes that are at once large, great in number, and of all different sorts. Now this matter of change, alteration, moving from state or condition A to state or condition B. There are fundamental things associated with a change in state and a change in condition. The two I had defined earlier. Now I surely have forgotten them, but it doesn't matter too much. That general concept of being one particular way at a given snapshot in time, this is composed of plenty of things, plenty of qualities, characteristics, ways of orienting. And it is by the various building blocks that produce the structure of identity, let's say of myself, of the human being, that we have some sort of coherent conception about self. I could say about a thing that I observe, for example, I take this bottle in my hand. There are many things about it that make it what it is. They're unique to itself. There are many things about it that are unique to the form of bottleness, and bottles can have many different shapes and sizes, many different colors, many different purposes, and yet they all share in that bottleness. Great change is something that disrupts, I think, the order of the forms, the expected progression of things given the agency of one, or the agency of, as the visitor will describe, the identities that were put into motion by the Creator. The visitor continues, he says, "Necessarily, then, there occur at that time cases of destruction of other living creatures on a very large scale, and humankind itself survives only in small numbers." Now, certainly we can say that in our history there have been many different situations that have led to the diminution of our species. And here I wonder at a few things. The first, I think it's important to identify some of the things that have caused that diminution. One is sort of an internal reduction. The internal reduction could be the absolute minimization of the number of souls on the earth, and that could be because of war. Carelessness can be another cause, which would be expressed in famine. Carelessness, I think, can be expanded in that case into conceit, into selfishness, that tyrannical desire, the despotism that often leads to famine. We could think about external factors, things of the natural course of things, like climate change, natural disasters, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. We could think about interstellar, or rather, large bodies within our solar system that impact the Earth, that end life. Again, the thought occurs to me that it is difficult to imagine that through line through the whole thing that causes this, maybe not necessarily domino effect, but an effect such that it is necessary for there to be a reduction. And I mean this to say that there is a cause somewhere that is so far outside of our sight that even if it is an earthquake, perhaps it is related to something else in some way. And its reduction in the human species is a part of some process. Now, that process may not be a deliberate process, at least to reduce the human experience, but it is a part of a natural process nonetheless. This thought is going to be something that has to be expanded upon and built. And in this vein, the visitor continues and he says, "Many new and astonishing things happen to them," being the human beings, "but the greatest is the one I shall describe, one that is in accordance with the retrogradation of the universe." So it's this universal cause that we were speaking about before, a cause that spans quite a distance, a figurative distance. At the time when its turning becomes the opposite of the one that now obtains. Now, even this idea of the concept of the turning, I think we have to be careful. We have to be careful because we don't necessarily understand what the structure of the thing is that is responsible for, or is the primary causal factor for the turning. The other part of this is, do we even know that the turning exists? Now, we say that we know that the turning exists because the visitor mentions earlier about reports of earlier human experience with quite profound changes in the way that they lived and their harmonization with each other and with nature. And I think a lot would depend on these accounts that the visitor is bringing forth. Because it would be such a a fruitless endeavor to go through this in entirely the contrary manner. Now, there will be contrary opinions. That's a natural part of discovering something that is true or something that is useful. But with respect to finding things that are good and tools that we can use in the mind for practical purposes, for purposes of moving us closer to the divine, I think we also have to have the other productive view. And so if we take the idea that there is a broad turning, now the turning, I think it must be said that it can be seen rather loosely until we have a fine analogy for it. And a fine analogy, I think, would be to have this circle in mind. Or the idea of a clock. But any number of things can work. We can take a sphere, and we could turn the sphere, and as we turn it, we find a different view of that sphere, a different perspective. If we look at a circle, and we imagine arrows that are going around the circle, we see a direction, and we can see the possibility for its reversal. Now, an absolute reversal seems to me to be a rather bizarre and unlikely scenario. But just as I may see the sphere in a particular manner, I think there's a way of seeing this in which I may come to understand a little bit better of how a retrograde experience that is of a more universal quality might be felt. And this is independent of really having to believe in an account given by a report that was so long ago where one may falter in the trust of its accuracy or authenticity. Now the visitor continues, he says, first, the visible age of each and every creature, whatever it was, stopped increasing, and everything that was mortal ceased moving in the direction of looking older. Now here's the first sentence of our struggle with understanding this. This is sort of a Benjamin Button-esque scenario. Are we to think that, in terms of the physicality of things, or perhaps literally, that the physical organisms are being reduced in a backwards direction towards their inception? And I think the answer to that is yes, because the visitor continues, he says, instead it changed back in the opposite direction and grew as it were younger, more tender. The white hairs of the older man or older men became black, and in turn the cheeks of those who had their beards became smooth again, returning each to his past bloom. The bodies of those in their puberty, becoming smoother and smaller each day and night, went back to the form of newborn children, which they came to resemble both in mind and in body. And from then on, they proceeded to waste away until they simply disappeared altogether. As for those who died a violent death at the time, the body of the dead person underwent the same effects, and quickly dissolved to nothing in a few days. Now there's a thought that occurred to me that I think is probably going to be an important guiding line through this. There's often talk of reading between the lines, and I never really understood what that meant. Until now I think about it, reflect on it a little bit differently. When I think about reading between the lines, a few things come to mind. One is that there are there's a space that we can move past. That if we are between two lines of text, what we see is white. But it is also in between the words that we read. If we had to make a parallel, perhaps it is much like our queen, who has her pawns of difference. Her pawns of difference are identifying and separating out the lines of text so that we can understand it. But by the overarching theme, new images emerge out of them. So what do I mean by this? I mean to say that, in a rather clunky way, that perhaps what we see on the surface, as of these reports of reverse aging and of the dead dissolving into nothing, the body of the dead dissolving into nothing, that this experience is not really the center point of our focus. It is rather to examine the effects of this retrogradation. And in thinking about the effects of retrogradation, I think we can imagine not only something that, in terms of time, is something completely beyond our perception, or at least immediate perception, immediate awareness, immediate thoughts, because we think so linearly in terms of a single lifetime, or in a few lifetimes, or even in the past couple thousand years. But beyond that, time has really had time to think, so to speak. Now, that's not to say that because there has been so much time, that then this scenario literally is likely to have happened. This would be far from the point that I'm trying to make. Rather, in seeing a reversal of things, or maybe more importantly, I should say, in seeing the movement of the king, who is represented again as that which is, or being, either forward, and in his motion forward, the queen moves in him, of course, because they are married, they are wed together, they are one. Along with that comes the pawns of difference, that every step the king takes, new identities are created, they are identified. They are allowed difference. When the king moves backwards on this scale, what was is now reduced. It is reduced back to a state of non-being. And it's this non-being, in a rather bizarre sense, that is more of the what in the Old Testament we find wicked. Or generally speaking, absence. It doesn't necessarily have to be wicked. But the other point is that when we find ourselves here, I think it is a place of a greater certainty, because we are dealing with mechanics. Now, understanding the, I don't like the term, or the expression, the domino effect of causes that move downstream from manipulating a particular piece in the mechanical, in philosophical mechanics or metaphysical mechanics. This manipulation can be correct or false. This is why we have our our diagrams. This is why we practice in this way. And so I think about a few different possibilities. The contrarian is always there, saying, well, what about this? What if it's the case that the age of reversal is not really something that was, but rather it is a possibility based on the reflection of these mechanics? Or perhaps the reversal is something that was, but rather than have such a strict reduction in being, because again, time as a dimension in the human mind and the human perception would seem to find an expectation similar to the reduction in aging, or to the reversal in aging towards infancy and then into nothingness. But perhaps it could be something a little bit more subtle, and that instead of thinking about things in terms of the king moving backwards, in the broader scale, what we are talking about is the cosmotic order being left independent or being governed. In its state of independence, it moves towards this abundance of difference. In its state of order, it is reorganized in a way. And this reorganization, I think, is quite related to the retroversion. But just because there's a reorganization of things doesn't mean it's put back to where it was before. And in fact, when we think about a complex system, say we take the system of our government, for example, and we talk about reorganization, well, there are two primary thoughts. One is that a reorganization in that political structure back to more founding principles would not reduce us culturally, or I say reduce, but it's not reduction in the negative sense, but a reduction to a previous point, in the sense that we would find ourselves without electricity and maintaining earlier philosophical principles of government, adopting earlier trends in terms of leisure and in terms of expression, spiritual expression in the arts and in philosophy, all of this sort of thing. Thoughts may be, the axioms may shift, and we may return to that point, but the seed is something that grows. The environment that it is in, of course, or perhaps I should even say that the type of seed that is planted, even if it is planted with the same constraints and a substrate, will still grow differently. So in the 21st century, there are many different things that we are dealing with now that they did not deal with then. And yet, on a fundamental level, certain things will remain the same. But what emerges is going to look different compared to what it was then and what it is now. And so the myth, I think, is good, even in the sense of identifying how beings are sort of reduced down back into the womb, so to speak, back into that creative process. In this way, they're reduced back into creative potential. That I find a very attractive idea. So young Socrates asks an important question. But visitor, how did living creatures come into being in that time? And in what way were they produced from each other? The visitor says, clearly, Socrates, reproduction from one another was not a part of the nature of things then. So let's pause there for a moment. So we have to remember that we are dovetailing between two things. One is the mythical, or maybe the literary thing that we are developing. That is this image of life being sucked up back into, maybe back into is not the right word, but life being changed. I want to be careful of focusing on the time and the linearity, if I can call it that, the linearness of time and of our experience and of life. Although recognizing that this is an important component of the myth that he is establishing. That in the king, as I see him in front of me now, as he takes a step, not forward, not backward, but rather as he is inclined towards a reordering. What we may find is that the productive spirit, instead of being instilled in all of the difference of identities, it is now being moved back into him. And because this productive spirit is being moved back into him, agency that is spread out across the identities is also being reduced. Now, I will say that I do not think, well, maybe I should save that for later. The visitor says, it was the earthborn race, the one said to have existed once, that existed then, returning to life again from the earth. Now, given again this conception of the king not moving forward, not moving backwards, and saying that specifically to move away from the linearness of movement, to get away from the human perspective of life and of the dimension of time, and perhaps to see it maybe a little bit more as the king might see it. The king, as he reasserts himself as the father or the dominant dog in a herd, makes his presence known, the attention of the identities are shifted towards him. Their individual agency is reduced. Their own selfish concerns are now diminished for the concerns of that ordering principle or structure. And so now we find ourselves in a place where we've experienced this reduction or this retrogradation, such that life has reverted to an infancy, a reduction in human species, whatever the particular scenario might be. We have now come to the thought of an earthborn race. One that existed at a particular time. Returning to life again from the earth. This is a particular type of, like if we imagine the earthborn race of man, it may not necessarily be the case that we would think about his physical incarnation in such a way as it is mentioned here. We can, certainly. Here there are invoked images of the Garden of Eden and of man that is born of dust. there are all sorts of different analogies, illustrations that come from this. That from the material substrate, of course, man is born. Of something simpler, man is born. Of something that is less consciously experiential, something more consciously experiential is born of it. We have, although I want to avoid the linearness of things, in this way it's useful to imagine that on a scale from agentic to non-agentic, what we have in the continuation forward, the reverse of the retrograde, is the production of that difference and difference of identity, and the emergence of identity on top of what has now been reordered by the king as he has sort of reasserted his dominance over the chaos that has unfolded in the play or the drama of difference. So to put this in other words, we could say that the Earthborn symbolize humanity in its most fundamental state. It's closer to being, less individuated, more directly tied to the ground of existence. They don't reproduce themselves, but rather emerge from that primordial source. And I think that this is possible if we think about broad civilizational sways. I think this is possible in terms of just thinking about the human being as a race. As the mind changes, as it orients, as it shifts, I think it is possible for it to come into contact with that reordering. It might be on what we talk about here is an extreme, obviously, the reordering of the cosmos, but reorderings, I think, can occur on much smaller scales if we think in this sort of fractal structure. But a reordering on, as it aligns, on the scale of a society or civilization, or perhaps the race as a whole, I think it's easy to imagine how the mind can change, how it can shift, how it can become more of that primordial state. Whereas in a state of profound disorganization and confusion, this would lead to situations like famine and like being unprepared for natural disasters. And as a result, that significantly reduces, or the other example that I mentioned, being subject to the changes of climate change. The people, whether they don't migrate soon enough, they don't follow the herds, or whatever it might be, and they perish because of it, it's because they're not paying attention. But when they go through these experiences, then they understand where they should be actually allocating their attention. And when this happens, then they are sort of set free. They are reintroduced into this more, not primitive, but fundamental state. Being closer to that primordial source of truth and of well-oriented attention. So again, to put it slightly differently still, the Earthborn race is a symbol of a reset. A humanity reborn directly from being's substrate, or the Earth, before difference and multiplicity fractures it again. To reiterate what the visitor had said, he says, "It was the Earthborn race, the one said to have existed, that existed then, returning to life again from the earth. It was remembered by our first ancestors, who lived in the succeeding time, but bordered on the ending of the previous period, growing up at the beginning of this one." So what an interesting thought that would be, or experience perhaps that would be, to be on that precipice of a civilizational change, more than just a civilizational change, but an orientational change of mind as it relates to reality, if it relates to its own idea of what its purpose is. A very strong reordering, I think that must be. So today is a new day. It's in the evening after work. It has been a long day. But as I usually say, beginning these segments anew, that a new day brings new thoughts. And so let's begin where we left off. The visitor continues by saying, "They became our messengers for the accounts of the earthborn, which are nowadays wrongly disbelieved by many people." So I want to pause there for a moment. There's an experience of late in my life where I have been thinking but also encountering these situations in which what is known, what is believed, what has been believed, is now exposed to a particular type of methodological examination. And I have faltered a little bit in my execution of it, I think. But the method is a combination of Old Testament thinking and also the Platonic. And by these methods, it's quite easy to see in a few different directions. One can say that one can interpret with a positive outlook or a negative, pessimistic, nihilistic attitudes are often seen by those that I encounter that are non-believers, people that are frustrated by something that they don't understand. And while I feel myself abandoning those beliefs and coming to something a little bit more mature and nuanced, I often find how subtle, how frustratingly subtle truth can be. And it requires a mind that is humble, relaxed, and doesn't give in to ready excitement. That doesn't mean that the heart can't be an active producer of its products. I think it should be. The more the better. But the more there is, the more that we have to be prudent and control it and direct it. And so to bring this into a little bit more of a focus, when I see this sentence, "They became our messengers for the accounts of the earthborn, which are nowadays wrongly disbelieved by many people," I think about all of the different ways in which this might be interpreted, or the Old Testament might be interpreted. And there is danger, in sort of the Humean sense, through which we may fall into a superstitious view of things. Superstitious in the sense that we attribute to things that are incorrectly. We falsely identify patterns in the stories that we tell ourselves. But the interesting thing about stories is that if we are to have an observation, it is almost like a snapshot of mind that now sort of exists out there. It is a pattern of potential. Now, whether it happens or not, I think it does matter, I suppose, but the way in which we see it surely does matter more, because if it is something that has happened, not merely something that is plausible or might happen, it's important that we ground it in such a way that it is reasonable. It is something that we can articulate with, and that we're not just sort of giving in to sophistry. And when the visitor says, "which are nowadays wrongly disbelieved by many people," I have to wonder at my own interpretation. I think it works well for my mind and for understanding this, that while I may not see it in the way that another might see it. Perhaps a particular type of ancient Greek might see it, in the sense that on the scale of the physical, on the minute scale, on the scale of the individual, that the individual experienced this Benjamin Button-esque scenario in which it was actually a part of their experience that they were reduced to infancy from a state of adulthood. I think the myth, this is my opinion, but I think the myth is lost on this, and I know I've said this before. The true meaning of the myth is lost on this before, but I say it to highlight the potential for this type of interpretation. And what would flood in from the contemporary mind would be frustration and disappointment. And so that's sort of a long-winded way to say that I want to remind myself that as I approach this, not just here in the philosophical domain, but in all aspects of life, that finding truth is a matter of discipline and of practice. It is not something that comes through frustration, because frustration will just lead to a quick, selfish answer that satisfies nothing other than that brutish, underlying emotion. Now the visitor continues. He says, "For I think we must reflect on what is implied, but what we have said. If old men went back to being children, it follows that people should be put together again from the dead, there in the earth, and come back to life." So keeping in line the thread that floats atop of this myth. So we think about, let me regather my thoughts from the other day. We think about the king. I'm getting all of my chess pieces out and putting them in front of me. So if we think about the king and his experience in being, let's say, we think about his creation, and by his creation perhaps we can symbolize, for the time being, as the rook. Now his creation has been set forth and has been unfolding for some period. Something has occurred. We've been thinking cosmologically, but we can say that something has occurred on any level, on any scale. Something has occurred in somebody's life. Something has occurred in the spirit of a corporate establishment, in a doctor's office, in a school setting, where now the spirit of that institution is affected. We could scale this up to the city and to the state and to the human collective as a whole. We could think about small events, physical events, natural events that occur, like storms, hurricanes, or tornadoes. We could think about sunny days and cloudy skies. All of this, at some level, participates with a particular process of order and disorder. And it's easy to get lost in that complexity. But insofar as we think about the reversal, again, not getting stuck in linearity, if again I could say it that way, and not getting lost in our perspective and in time, it's much easier to see that the reversal is not just an exact one-to-one. That the reversal, when we speak of old men going back into children, we have to think about what's useful about that experience. The physical or the imagistic fails us, I think, at a certain degree. But when we imagine ourselves in our experience, if I were to suddenly be reverted to my adolescence, I would not know it. I would not have memories of being an adult. I would be fine with being an adolescent. But the two states are fundamentally different. My adult mind is much different than my adolescent mind, both in terms of perspective, maturation, capacity, desire. This reversal, if it were to happen today, much of the structure of my life would fall apart, because I would not have the skills necessary to maintain myself in this society. Now, if we flip the script and we say that from the dead, maybe it's not flipping the script necessarily, but if we think about the dead, we have this conception of the dead being in the earth, that there is this idea of what was, a particular type of being that had gone through their life cycle in the forward progression, had lived through it, had died, their memories given to the earth, dissipated. And now the earth, a structure, a material that is not as sophisticated or heavenly as what its constituent elements can be rearranged to accomplish or to afford, such as the human mind, it occupies nonetheless the potential for that experience. So now when we think about the dead being put together again, what we're thinking about is a mind from a particular state of not necessarily culture or philosophy, though there are principled elements, perhaps axiomatic elements, that are important here. Principle and axiomatic in the imagistic sense of that which rotates around a central point, that central point being the principle that is fixed into a firm surface. That firm surface is the environment. That environment is both physical and mental. Physical in the sense that we need strong societies. We need strong tools to build our societies. We need strong buildings to house ourselves. We need solid institutions and all of the physical material that goes into that. And then we need the discipline of mind, which can be quite variable, but ultimately anchored in discipline and attention. Now, out of all of the variability, I think it can be said that it is reasonable that a principled generation, one that has been restored in the backdrop against the instability of a particular institution or of a particular race, a particular culture of people that has come to be, that now in the broad scale, in the broad turning, is now being reduced and the dead being brought forward to occupy that more stable or kingly expression. This we find to be at the present juncture in our exploration of this dialogue. The visitor continues. He says, they would be following the reversal of things, with coming into being, turning round with it to the opposite direction. And since they would, according to this argument, necessarily come into existence as earthborn, they would thus acquire that name and have that account given of them. So, an important word is coming into being, turning round with it to the opposite direction. Now, I think it's easy to get lost in the mechanics or of the direction of this. I think what can be done to help this along is to give it less of a linear direction. And I say this because it's not about returning to a state. It's a particular state with a lot of potential. If I was to let's see what the appropriate analogy would be. If I was going to go in the opposite direction, let's just say literally reverse time, until I found myself back at work, all that has been done was to change my physical position. But it would be more meaningful to say that in the reversal or the opposite direction, instead of going back to work, I have gained a particular perspective, responsibility, and I found myself in an entirely new environment. The visitor continues. He says, they would thus acquire that name and have that account given of them. All of those them, that is, whom God did not take off to another destiny. So there's quite a personal reference here. There's a reference, I think, towards the soul of the individual. And I say that because of destiny. And he's referring to those individuals who God specifically did not take off to go to a different place. And so there's a broader image here that I think is fascinating about the extended experience of mind and of soul. Here is something I think I need to develop even farther. Much like we were talking about earlier, I wouldn't want to get lost in a place of superstition that I can't sort of walk my way to regularly and walk my way back out of regularly. So eventually I think we're going to have to come to thinking about individuality and the maintenance of the individual as something separate from the body. And I think that there are good reasons to think that it is impossible to separate it. I've said before on this podcast that I think it's impossible to separate it insofar as the identity would not be the same if you removed it from the body. That it is possible to maintain something of mind beyond its body, but the thing that it becomes is now different. It is something that perhaps the thing before, if it was to be related now to this thing that is separate, perhaps would not recognize it. When we look at a body that is separated from its soul, we may see someone that is familiar to us, but we don't have that feeling of connection and excitement, perhaps. It is because we understand that their soul has gone that the identity of that thing is now different. Likewise, instead of in the casket, if we were to see not the body, but the soul, what we would see is something difficult to identify, something perhaps that we can be excited by and communicate with, but in a manner that is different because we don't understand its perspective of experience. It lacks body, in other words. Now, the etymology of the word destiny comes from the Latin, meaning to make firm, to establish, to appoint, to determine. The word destinare, the prefix de, means down, away, thoroughly. Stare, stare, S-T-A-R-E, to stand. So at its root, that word means to cause to stand firmly, to fix in place. Now, the Old French, destiny had the meaning of fate, purpose, that which is predetermined. In Middle English, we have the word destiny, meaning fate, lot, again, predetermined course of events. So destiny, we have this idea of fixed or fixedness, what is firmly appointed, something that cannot be changed. And teleology, some directedness towards an end. Destiny implies a purpose or order, while chance implies randomness. And so that it's interesting that he mentions another destiny, because there is the implication that the destiny or the fixedness in place of this, of the dead that have now come to be the earthborn people, that there is a certain fixedness about their nature. That they have been brought up in a particular period, a particular time, in a particular context, that is at a profound change in the way that they must orient themselves relative to those that had come before, if they are to survive. So now, in response, we have young Socrates saying, yes, quite. This does seem to follow on what went before. But as for the life which you say there was in the time of Cronus, or Cronus's power, was it in that period of rotation, or in this one? For it clearly turns out that the change affecting the stars and the sun occurs in each period. So what can we make of this period of Cronus? Let's give a little bit of historical context to this. Now, on the surface, the historical context. Cronus, in Greek mythology, is one of the Titans, the generation before the Olympian gods. He was the son of Uranus, or Sky, and Gaia, Earth. Cronus overthrew his father Uranus by castrating him, then ruled during what later poets called the Golden Age, a time of abundance, harmony, and human innocence. Fearing that his own children would overthrow him, he swallowed each one at birth. But Zeus was hidden away and grew up, and forced Cronus to dislodge or disgorge his siblings, and then overthrew him in turn. Okay, so getting back to what young Socrates is saying, we now have an interesting reflection. I think we can pose the question ourselves to our own period. That might seem kind of strange, but it would be a different mythological structure, perhaps slightly different characters involved, but all the same, we could still imagine a scenario in which that which is taking more of a central role. The king is more involved, and the agency of I'm trying to find how the author, or the translator rather, refers to this. He says, one era, when it is under God's control, under control of Cronus, one under its own inherent power. This is sort of the era of difference, of multiplicity. Now, young Socrates points out that change affecting the stars and the sun occurs in each period. So in a way, he's asking, in what way can we cosmologically ascertain whether or not we are under a particular type of leadership or a particular type of governance, regardless of the character that's involved, Cronus or Zeus, whatever. So I want to think a little bit about the protracted footnote by the translator and see if what we have come to so far agrees with what he has to say. He says, the translation of the text is based on the assumption that in the myth as a whole, the visitor envisages two eras, during both of which the cosmos rotates, as it now does, from east to west, separated by a relatively brief period of rotation in the reverse direction, so that then the sun rises in the west and sets in the east. This reverse rotation begins immediately after the god releases control. So immediately after the god releases control, the period where multiplicity begins, the period where difference utilizes divine order in order to build upon itself, to be productive, and to create additional agents, a greater degree of agency. He says, i.e., at the outset of the time when the cosmos rules itself, and it ends when the cosmos gains sufficient self-possession to return to rotating in the normal east to west direction. Now, in this way, we're thinking about something slightly different interpretation. Instead of the reverse rotation being the God's connection point, being his influence over the multiplicity that is, and exerting his order, bringing things back into line, into unity. Instead, the reverse rotation begins after God has released his control. This is when the cosmos rules itself. Now, the ending is interesting. Regardless of the interpretation, the ending indicates a particular type, standard or qualification that self-possession must occur. And I think this is no trivial matter to think about self-possession. When we think about agents, of course we have to think about self-possession. That I am not God, I am not the unifying form of all that is, but I am a part of that thing. And I have been given my own agency. And because I have been given my own agency, my sight is necessarily limited. I am prone to fits of disorder, uncertainty, and falsehood. The translator continues, he says, on this interpretation, the visitor has just been describing the earthborn people as existing during the relatively brief period of reverse rotation. So again, the period when they have just been released by the order of God. Or rather, they are born on top of that order, let's say. And time, and young Socrates now asks whether the golden age of Cronus also occurred during that time, or instead in an era that preceded it. So an interesting reflection in the sense that I can imagine these eras occurring many times. There have been many cycles and many changes, just as there have been many people that have come to be born and come to have died. The alternative translation fits with a different interpretation of the myth, which is that of most scholars. According to this prevailing interpretation, the visitor envisages more simply two alternating eras, one west to east, one under God's control, and one under east to west rotation. We are familiar with this latter, for us normal, direction of rotation occupies the whole of the time when the cosmos is under self-rule. On this interpretation, there is no intervening brief period of reverse rotation. So the visitor's description of the earthborn people has placed them in the era of God's control. Accordingly, young Socrates is now asking whether the golden age of Cronus existed in that same era, or instead during the era we now live in. So we'll leave that as it is. Let's continue now with interpreting what the visitor has to say. He says, "You have been keeping up with the argument well. As for what you asked, about everything springing up of its own accord for human beings, it belongs least to the period that now obtains." Now, to focus for a moment on that expression, about everything's springing up of its own accord for human beings. Now, what does this mean? It would seem that young Socrates hasn't asked this question at all. Everything's springing up of its own accord for human beings. But young Socrates does mention the life there was in the time of Cronus' power. And so by this, when everything is springing up for the human being, there is an implication that there is abundance, that there is, perhaps most importantly, common sense. People understand where their attention ought to be. The earthborn are those that are rejuvenated. They are born anew. The prior chains that had held the old civilization in confinement is no longer their burden. But the visitor says that this is not, or it belongs least, to the period that now obtains. So if we are to imagine this period that now obtains as something that is equivalent to that which is least as it is associated to the age of Cronus, again, the era of abundance and improved focus, attention, discipline, reorientation of the framework of the mind. And we think about its opposite, or we think about it, but reduce it significantly. So in terms of abundance, we scale that down into subsistence. In terms of attention and discipline, we find the more sinful things, lethargy, the passivity of mind, or the attention deficit, which is all too common now in our present era. And there's another interesting aspect of this. The interesting part about it is a few things, I suppose, but I think about the fact that this is coming out of a period of productive philosophy in Greece. While even if they consider themselves not to be in the prosperous era, they are producing things of value. Some of this, I have to wonder, it's easy to get split into two things, thinking about how the self relates to this, and thinking about how the collective or the cultural milieu might be influenced or related to it. On one hand, they are related, I think, in quite strong ways, given that the collective is just an expression of a more populated singularity of mind. He says, it too belonged to the one before. Now what does he mean by this? It's likely that he's referring to the age of Kronos. Now, I've sort of been waiting for this type of expression to come from the visitor. And perhaps my interpretation is wrong. That's very likely. Or at least possible. But I have to think that it too belonging to the one before, if we are to say that it is referring to the age in which everything sprung up of its own accord for human beings, then we have to imagine that it was not as though human beings sprung up from the earth, like a tree does, so to speak. He's likely saying that they came from a generation before. Now, it doesn't really bar the majesty of what had occurred, because to go from one iteration to the next and have it be so sudden is a divine experience. There's no question about that. If the mind is suddenly oriented towards the good, while surely still maintaining its sin by its inability to see all of that which is, it approaches something in the divine moment, understanding that there are plenty of iterations of this. Each successive generation is an example of an iteration. They may be moving towards or moving away, they may be quite far, and then they flip over, as in the case that we're talking about here with the divine intervention. Now, it could also be referring to being it too belonging to the one before, referring to the period that now obtains, in which case I think we also have quite an easy time of imagining that the lethargy and the distraction that is of contrast to the age of Chronos exists because of some prior experience in the same manner. Their forefathers raised them in the similar cultural expectation. Now, I suppose I'll pause here and say that it's possible that I'm misinterpreting one, in the first instance, attributing to that of Age of Chronos, or attributing it to the contrary age. So we'll have to keep this in mind as we keep going. I'm still going to maintain that of my previous explorations as it pertains to the age or the nature, the structure of the human species before the age of Chronos. I don't think it was something that was completely abandoned from the natural landscape until all of a sudden there appeared without any cause their experience. Because out of everything that we understand the way things to be, it's not that way that things spontaneously come into being without that direction. But things can come into being when they assume the type of mind that the human being has. And I think there are other ways perhaps that we can think about this. In ways in which, there must necessarily be. But here I get lost in the human being's perception of time. Because if time is not such an important dimension, then all of the more simple causal relationships begin to seem more and more divine in their nature. And at the end of it, of course, we have our first cause. And I suppose that within this perspective of time, I view the establishment of things in such a way that because of this time, it makes that establishment seem foreign. And perhaps it is an unfortunate aspect of mind that I'm unable to maintain a more beautiful sense of things. But maybe I should be a little bit more kind, because there are plenty of beautiful things that still exist here. And I shouldn't even put it that way. There are plenty of things that are beautiful that are to be discovered. And in fact, I think most things are yet to be discovered. It is only until I feel that myself is an expression of more than it is that I find myself lacking in that thing that actually sustains me. He says, "For then the God began to rule and take care of the rotation itself as a whole. And as for the regions, in their turn, it was divided up by the gods ruling over them." So what does this mean? So in the first instance, we are asked to consider the reign of the God. And of course, in the reign of the God, we find stability, we find order, we find beauty, a greater certainty, but also less individual liberty, so to speak. And one has to wonder exactly what this means. And I think it means a diminished agency. And I have to wonder how this relates to things, because in one instance it would have to be that what the human being sacrifices in terms of his awareness of himself to provide for himself is that he must be provided for. He must, again, this is a scale, so in one sense he can be provided for marginally or maximally by the natural abundance and aided by his intuition and genius. But even something more at the core, I think, of the human experience is that feeling of purpose and of connectedness. The feeling of connectedness is, it can certainly be backed up by a professional or a skilled understanding of things. But I think we can understand that now we can have quite a sophisticated understanding of the world, but culturally we can be sort of void of this intuitive peace and happiness. I don't wish to draw everything down to an intuition. But then again, I'm not really sure exactly what I do mean. For I, think of this experience right now as being something highly agentic, selfish to a degree, by myself. I'm thinking about things perhaps outside of myself sometimes, but here nonetheless we're thinking about self. And I have to wonder what the two conditions necessarily feel like. The experience of them, I think, would be important to aid in understanding. But I suppose something that I had failed to recognize was that there are plenty of things that build into a particular experience. Let's say experience in anything. Expertise. We've been talking about that quite a bit with the sophist and the visitor looking for the statesman. Expertise is fundamental to experience. It is something that we can come back to reliably to build upon. And as we build higher upon these skills, I think there are new insights that are gained about the relationships among things. And the more patterns we know and understand and can participate with, the more connected we feel. And there are particular states of mind that we can arrive at that are less disposed to the type of exertion that would be required to have us feel as though we are really connected to something, whether that be a particular skill or to a particular group or a large set, a cultural set, for example. So my apologies, but today is a new day, and a new day brings new thoughts. So I remember vaguely where I was going last segment. I may have to cut it short so we can return to the text. Entirely rounding this out, from what I remember, was a bit of a long process. But the general thought that comes to mind is that when the singular, when the human being or the many fall into that trap of complacency and maybe levity in a sense, when they let the inferior motives take control, that while in the immediate sense they don't destroy them or destroy their posterity, but over time they suffer a gradual death. And it is by the loosening of their sentimental spirit and their productive energies that over time they begin to fall into that unguided age. But of course, what we are speaking of now is when the god began to rule and take care of the rotation. So he says, take care of the rotation itself as a whole. There's the implication, or the image, that all of things are connected. Some more intimately than others. Some share perhaps just on basic constitution about what happens to them in their state of nature, the laws that they obey. Some may be quite interrelated, and changing one part has a strong reverberation to the other parts that are so closely related to that thing. In the extremes, I think we find interesting images, but nonetheless, the important thing is to be able to tether through the ends to the extremes of those things that are differentiated so far from other things, and that the things that are differentiated that are not so far off from other things. So when I think about when the visitor is implying that there's a change on the whole that reverberates throughout the whole of the thing, I have to wonder at what thing so subtle can set that whole thing off, and I don't think I'll ever have the answer. But the image is one that is important to keep with us. Regardless of what may be at the top of it all, It's my personal opinion that all images are useful. They all say something that is. But in our extrapolations, surely there are things that we may mistaken. But we always have to remember that spirit that flows through all things. And sometimes it's easy to get lost in material things in the way that they approximate, or get lost in the mind in the way that it can seemingly go anywhere that it may please, that it chooses. It could be lazy in finding harmony or relevance or truth, and that's dangerous. And it may convince itself that it has understood that which it really has not. So I say that to say that while though there are great dangers in expanding the mind in this way, I think what we are exposed to here is an invaluable tool to consider, to reflect upon those things that are close to us that we can, I suppose, manage through our reason. We scale them up. Perhaps we can only scale them up so far as the mind is able to accept. But nonetheless, we scale them up and we can see out over our societies. And we can see that there are spirits among us, surely. At the bare minimum, the rationalist will find plenty of interesting spirits in the human condition. But here, on the axioms that rotate, on the principles perhaps that rotate, what we wish to establish is a machine that allows us to easily, or more simply, place that which is out of our grasp on a type of wheel that once we spin it around, it is colored in by various contextual things that we may consider. The visitor says, and as for the regions, in their turn, it was just the same. The parts of the world order having everywhere been divided up by the gods ruling over them. And so here I have to wonder, I imagine this river that was dead and dried up before, and by some event, by the reintegration of the gods, we have this flow of water now that flows downstream down this river. And along the way there are these tributaries that develop. They go to different areas. They permeate different lands. They provide for the vegetation to grow. They allow for the animals to feed. It's a productive image. But along these tributaries, if one of these animals looked up at it and saw it, and attributed to that thing its sole governor, then surely they would miss the reflection about the singular governor that governs all. And yet it's also interesting to think about a layer of systematic governors, divine governors, that each have a region, that region is reordered in a particular way. Other regions are ordered in other ways, perhaps ways that are more appropriate to it. Earlier we were talking about, in some sense, the difference between the king and the statesman. But maybe it wasn't so different. But nonetheless, that of the ruler how it's important that when the ruler rules, what they are attempting to do is to maximize, to reduce the sophists' territory, to reduce that fog through which ignorance breeds, and to recognize those things among identities that are shared and that are necessary to maintain identity itself. In such a way, the governor is not only a participant, but a facilitator of life and of expression. Now, shortly after we have this divine outpouring, which orders everything downstream, we also have that progression of his partner, of his queen. And those pawns of difference surround identities, dividing things up, as it necessarily needs to. As for living things, says the visitor, divine spirits had divided them between themselves like herdsmen, by kind and by herd, each by himself providing independently for all the needs of those he tended, so that none of them was savage, nor did they eat each other. And there was no war or internal dissent at all. So now here we see a lower order of this spiritual hierarchy, which was a plurality of gods governing their particular regions. Now inside of this region we have living things. And among these living things we have divine spirits, which seemingly are less than gods. And they had divided the various species and perhaps tribes of men, he says, by kind and by herd, each by himself providing independently for all the needs of those he tended. And so it's a beautiful image. He says, so that none of them was savage, nor did they eat each other. Can you imagine? But it's a beautiful image, because what's coming down is a reverberation through that hierarchy of divinity. And so we see how the human being is affected by it, that they are governed by the spirits that can exist on their minds, or it can be perceived by their minds. And it's the governance of those spirits that cause the mind to evolve, but also for a harmony to occur. Because surely we can't say that at the point we are speaking now or listening now, this is not the pinnacle of awareness of man's mind. But there are steps, I suppose, to this, both in the individual life as there is in the collective ancestral sense. Now there's a particular line that I want to spend a little bit of time focusing on. The visitor says, as for living things, divine spirits had divided them between themselves like herdsmen, by kind and by herd, each by himself providing independently for all the needs of those he tended, so that none of them was savage. So, providing independently for the needs. Now, a need is something that I think is no simple matter, at least on first approach. There are some obvious needs, given the context, what we can say in one instance that a need is something that we cannot survive without. But then also we can say that a human being needs to be brought up in an environment of social establishments and of common identity for a healthy rearing. And so we have these two types of definitions when we speak of the word need. Some more fundamental, and others, I suppose, still fundamental, but with their absence, the body still remains preserved, albeit in its savage state. So there's an image that also comes to mind about that when the fundamentals are not met, fundamentals in terms of meeting those needs, food and shelter, that man becomes savage. It is by the neglect of these things that he reverts to a state of a living, agentic creature, but prior to his needs being fulfilled. And I have to wonder here about what it means, in the first case, to be a spiritual or divine being that has the capacity to govern. I think we've skipped over a few steps here. And then also I wonder exactly how it is that these needs are met by the order of these divine spirits. So if we think about our experience, the divine influence is something that comes to our awareness. It is a pattern that is given to us, a pattern through which we can see a little bit farther into what we call reality. Many of them have practical purposes. Some of these practical purposes may be to guarantee safety, or to guarantee food production, to guarantee a degree of stability. And it can be seen that the divine spirits, a spirit being something that transcends boundaries, in the sense that they can exist in a particular form under a certain set of restraints and be seen by the experience of man, and yet in another age they can manifest quite differently, either more brightly or more dimly, whatever is required of that spirit. The spirit of liberty is one of those that I think about quite often, because in different ages, whether it be in English, throughout English history or the world history, and in the case of the American, liberty can be quite a slippery subject, but the spirit nonetheless remains. And so, I think from this, we could think about the spiritual side of nature, which is something that is there, that must be attended to. And then we could think about the more intrinsic, willful acceptance of that spirit. And what goes along with that is a particular disposition of mind. I was just watching today, for whatever reason, this show in which they were discussing racial differences in the United States, but particularly violence as it pertains to the black community in inner cities in the United States, and how this is a particular phenomena of particular interest right now politically. President Trump is considering sending federal troops to Chicago, an area that I live quite close to attempt to bring order to a city that is in chaos, that poorly manages their policing. And it's not because of the police officers, it's because of management, local government. But nonetheless, there are people that feel that this is inappropriate, and there are plenty that feel that it is appropriate. I mention this because it's an important and appropriate reflection. Culture is a particular way of illuminating that perspective of mind. And many that live outside of these populations, they get into oftentimes gangs block by block, and then rivalries block by block, shooting each other, killing each other. And then you contrast that to a broader population with a different set of values, a different outlook. And the difference between the two it's a stark contrast. And the intervention that would be necessary to turn the mind away from such tribalistic behaviors is substantial. And I imagine the incidents that would be brought forth to spur such a transformation. And I think of two things here. I think of human intervention to correct their error. I think about superstition, or those ways in which we can perceive an unfortunate event as being the cause of our demise. But rather frequently, I think it is the unfortunate natural event that occurs on a population that is unprepared and unequipped to handle the consequence of it that causes it to be so devastating. But in its wake, what it reveals is the Spirit's path. That is to say, there's a particular way of orienting ourselves in such a manner that if an unfortunate incident were to happen to us again, we would now be prepared. And within the discipline that's required to meet the standard of that preparedness, the mind undergoes a change in its perspective, perhaps its morals, certainly its attention, and its desire to participate. And so while it may not be wise to think about the reduction in the savagery and the relative savagery that we see on behalf of the inner city gangs in Chicago, compared with that of some of the surrounding communities that are more stable, safer, less prone to commit crime, and to insult their neighbors. There is always that danger to encounter superstition, to attribute some false cause, and to focus on that thing, however trivial it might be. But on the flip side, it can be easy to miss that which would otherwise perhaps seem superstitious, but within its relationship, not necessarily a causal relationship, but just relationship in general, while causes may be a part of it. So let's say, to make this more concrete, when we think about the inner city gangs who are responsible for the selling of hard drugs and all sorts of other degenerate behavior, it would be easy to attribute to that degeneracy some innate quality to the race or to that population that lives in the inner city. This would be more of a superstitious relationship, I think, that they've been endowed by their creator with some unfortunate ailment of experience, such that they're prone to violence and to imbecility. But of course, when we say this, we get lost in a false cause. And I don't wish here to say that all causes, again, are something that we need to avoid. We most certainly must find them and attribute them appropriately when we find them. But what is also extremely important when we consider solving a problem, apart from their causes, are their relationships. So, in the extreme case, when we speak about the divine spirit providing for man such that he is not prone to savagery, the small material causes that would perhaps material relationships, but I fall back into causes for some reason. These small causes, while taken by themselves as for a primary reason, perhaps would fall in that realm of superstition. In aggregate, as we see them all, with a particular, here's where the relationship comes in, with a particular relationship, by that a particular orientation. That is to say, if I'm an inner city youth, that despite the causes for my predicament and for my worldview, there are things that I may attend to that may break me out of it, that would allow me to come to a greater harmony with the people around me and to the situation in general, such that it can be something that is seen as a bad thing and be seen as something that is not desired, but something that is preventable and solvable. I think the realization precedes that of the recognition of causes. Or at least it can. Perhaps the recognition of causes may lead to the realization. It's hard to say. But I suppose it must be a two-way street since they are in relation. And this matter of material causality stimulating spiritual reflection is not always a superstitious matter, but rather it is a necessary part of us understanding what the spirits have to say and exactly what they can show us. So in the case of federal troops entering Chicago, it seems like it's quite a neutral spirit. It can go either way. It can be seen, interpreted in terms of an oppressive force in which there must be this liberatory spirit that's expressed on the part of the savage, or it is a restraining force that reduces the savagery. It constricts it into a narrow band, and behavior. You would hope that it would be genuine, but maybe is only superficially repressed. What we would wish for in the most idyllic of circumstances is the spirit of harmony would reorient agency without destroying it, much like the divine herdsman under Cronus. And just for matters of effect, I would like to repeat when he says, "Nor did they eat each other, and there was no war or internal dissent at all." Now he continues, he says, "And as for all the other things that belong as consequences to such an arrangement, there would be tens of thousands of them to report." So that being tens of thousands of ways in which behavior might be corrected or the spirit is seen. He continues, "But to return to what we have been told about a human life without toil, the origin of the report is something like this. A God tended to them, taking charge of them himself, just as now human beings, themselves living creatures, but different and more divine, pasture other kinds of living creatures more lowly than themselves. And given this tendance, they had no political constitutions, no required wives and children, for all of them came back to life from the earth, remembering nothing of the past." So it's quite difficult to imagine the direct relationship here. We can go quite far symbolically, but when we go down to claims like there were no wives, or rather it was not required, as the visitor says, they had no political constitutions, nor required wives and children, for all of them came back to life from the earth, remembering nothing of the past. We've reflected on this before, such a profound transformation that must occur in order for there not to be these strong associations with the age prior, and a divine spark that would reset all of relation, where there's a clean cut between one set of human beings that were before and into this new era in which their kind was not something that was born, it was not something that was brought up, but rather divinely herded. While they lacked things of this sort, they had an abundance of fruits from trees and many other plants, which grew not through cultivation, but because the earth sent them up of its own accord. So we could see this potentially coinciding with a climate, a particular time of climate. Now again, I don't want to get lost in causes. Material causes will show us a particular aspect of the divine nature. But we can also just think about abundance for the sake of abundance, as it has occurred in this particular period. Now, abundance, just having things available, seems to orient the mind already towards a particular type of spirit. And we can see that when the mind is oriented there, the relationship is established. Because not only are they looking at what the spirit is providing, but they are physically reaping the benefits. For the most part, they would feed outdoors, naked and without bedding. For the blend of the seasons was without painful extremes, and they had soft beds from abundant grass that sprang from the earth. What are you hearing about, then, Socrates? Is the life of those who lived in the time of Cronus? As for this one, which they say is in the time of Zeus, the present one, you are familiar with it from personal experience. Would you be able and willing to judge which of the two is more fortunate? And so this is where we finish those 2 pages. Now, as for the rest of that, we've already explored abundance, so he just goes into a couple more examples of abundance. I'm still going to be searching through the metaphysics of this and trying to work my way also through these loopholes that I can't seem to get over in the sense of the material cause of things. How it may seem to me to be so impossible to imagine a scenario in which, on a sudden, people find themselves in a state of abundance. How the mechanics of this work, metaphysically, philosophically. So I'm going to end this episode here and continue next time.